Lieutenant Margaret Chen stood in the processing room of Camp Ashford, holding a cardboard box filled with gold bands. The order from command was clear: confiscate all valuables from incoming prisoners. Standard protocol. But inside that box were 43 wedding rings, and the German women who'd surrendered them 3 hours earlier were still crying. Chen had processed thousands of prisoners since D-Day. She'd seen men hand over watches that had belonged to their fathers, women surrender lockets with children's photos inside. But this felt different. The sound coming from the women's barracks wasn't just crying. It was grief. Raw, ancient grief. And Chen, who'd followed every regulation for 18 months of service, was about to break the most important rule of all. She picked up one of the rings. Simple gold, worn thin on one side from years of wear. Inside, an inscription in German, Ewig dein, forever yours. Chen didn't speak German, but she knew what wedding rings meant. She knew what they represented when everything else had been destroyed. And she knew that in about 20 minutes, her commanding officer would walk through that door expecting to see the valuables secured and logged. What Chen decided in those 20 minutes would end her military career. But it would also become one of the most documented acts of compassion in the European theater's final days. April 1945. The war was ending, but nobody had told the chaos. Across Germany, hundreds of thousands of people were in motion. Refugees fleeing the Soviet advance, displaced persons searching for home, and prisoners. So many prisoners. The camps couldn't hold them all. Every day brought new transports, new faces, new stories of survival and loss. Camp Ashford, located in a requisitioned textile factory outside Reims, France, had been processing female prisoners for 6 weeks. Most were German military auxiliaries, typists, radio operators, nurses who'd worked behind the lines, women who'd worn uniforms but rarely held weapons. By April, the American command was overwhelmed. The camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and understaffed. Processing incoming prisoners meant getting them cataloged, searched, and secured as quickly as possible. The standard procedure was brutal in its efficiency. Strip search, medical inspection, confiscation of all personal items, delousing, prison uniform, assignment to barracks. The goal wasn't cruelty, it was control. When you're managing 20,000 prisoners with limited resources, sentiment becomes a luxury you can't afford. Lieutenant Margaret Chen had arrived at Ashford in February 1945. She was 26 years old, born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents who'd worked 16-hour days in a laundry to send her to college. Her father, Chen Wei, had come to America in 1910 with nothing but determination and a belief that hard work could overcome any obstacle. Her mother, Lin Mei, had followed in 1912, crossing an ocean to marry a man she'd met only once, trusting that this strange country might offer their future children opportunities China never could. They'd been right, but the cost had been enormous. Margaret grew up watching her parents bow and scrape to customers who treated them with casual contempt. She'd seen her father accept insults without response, because defending himself might mean losing business. She'd watched her mother's hands crack and bleed from the harsh laundry chemicals, never complaining, never resting. They'd taught her that survival meant following rules, staying invisible, never making trouble. But they'd also taught her something else. Her father had a phrase he repeated often, usually in Cantonese when he thought she wasn't listening. When you have power, use it to protect those who have none. He'd said it after giving food to a homeless man who'd wandered into their neighborhood. He'd said it after refusing to evict a tenant who couldn't pay rent during the Depression. He'd said it when Margaret told him she wanted to join the military, wanted to serve, wanted to be part of something larger than herself. You will see terrible things, he'd told her the night before she left for training. War makes people forget they are human. But you, Margaret, you must remember. You must be the one who remembers. She'd carried those words through 18 months of service. through the chaos of processing thousands of displaced people, through the bureaucracy and exhaustion and soul-crushing efficiency of managing human misery at industrial scale. She'd followed every rule, executed every procedure, maintained the distance between officer and prisoner that regulations required, until the wedding rings. Chen had joined the WAC in 1943, trained as an administrative officer, and spent a year processing paperwork in London before volunteering for field assignment. She wanted to be useful. She wanted to see the war that had consumed the world for 6 years. Her friends back home, the ones who hadn't enlisted, were working in factories, selling war bonds, growing victory gardens. Important work, necessary work. But Margaret had wanted to be closer to the center of things. She'd wanted to matter. What she found instead was that war wasn't glory and purpose. It was exhaustion, not the dramatic exhaustion of combat, but the grinding weariness of managing human misery at industrial scale. Every day, women arrived at the gates. Women who'd been walking for weeks. Women who'd lost everything. Women who looked like they'd aged decades in months. Chen processed them with professional efficiency. Name, rank, unit assignment. Medical concerns. Special circumstances. Into the system they went. She'd become good at it. Too good, perhaps. She could process a transport of 50 women in under 3 hours. She could spot potential security risks, identify medical emergencies, maintain order even when prisoners were hysterical with fear or grief. Her efficiency reports were exemplary. Captain Bradford had mentioned her for commendation twice. She was on track for promotion. But efficiency came at a cost. Chen had learned to stop seeing individuals. It was the only way to survive the job. If you looked too closely at each face, heard too many stories, let yourself feel too much, you'd break. So you maintained distance. You followed procedure. You treated people like inventory because treating them like people would destroy you. The wedding ring shattered that protective distance. The transport arrived on April 23, 1945. 43 women, ages ranging from 19 to 56. They'd surrendered to American forces near Stuttgart 3 days earlier. Most had been support staff at a Wehrmacht communications hub. When the Americans came, they'd walked out of the building with their hands up, grateful to be surrendering to Americans instead of Soviets. The journey to Ashford had been rough. They'd spent 2 nights sleeping in the back of a military truck. No blankets. Minimal food. One of the women, a radio operator named Ilse who was 7 months pregnant, had gone into early labor during the transport. The medics had managed to stabilize her, but she was still pale and shaking when they arrived. The truck pulled into Ashford just after dawn. Chen watched from the processing office window as the women climbed down. They moved slowly, stiffly, like people who'd forgotten how their bodies worked. 2 guards escorted them toward the registration building. Standard procedure. Chen had done this hundreds of times. But when the women entered the processing room and the order came to remove all jewelry and valuables, something broke. One woman, maybe 30 years old with blonde hair that had been cropped short, twisted her wedding ring off her finger. Her hands were shaking so badly it took her 3 tries. When she finally got it off, she held it for a long moment, staring at it like she was memorizing every detail. Then she placed it in the collection box with a care that felt almost ceremonial. She didn't make a sound, but tears ran down her face in steady streams. The woman next to her, older, with gray streaking her dark hair and deep lines around her eyes, saw this and began to sob. Not quietly, not with restraint. She sobbed the way people sob at funerals, at bedsides, when something precious is being ripped away and there's no way to stop it. Her whole body shook with it. She removed her ring with trembling fingers, placed it in the box, covered her face with both hands and wept like her heart was breaking. Within seconds, it spread through the group like a contagion. 43 women removing 43 rings, and every single one was crying. Some cried silently, tears tracking down hollow cheeks. Some sobbed openly, shoulders heaving. One young woman, she couldn't have been more than 20, sank to her knees, clutching her ring in both hands, keening. The sound filled the processing room. It echoed off the concrete walls. It was the sound of loss compounding loss, of one more piece of self being stripped away. Chen stood behind her desk watching this and felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't protocol. This was cruelty dressed up as efficiency. Sergeant Morrison, who'd been working the camp for 4 months and had seen everything, stepped close to Chen. "Don't," she said quietly. "I know what you're thinking. Don't. They're wedding rings," Chen said. "They're valuables. Command says confiscate valuables." Morrison kept her voice low. "You know what happens if you don't follow orders." Chen did know. She'd seen 2 officers reassigned for being too lenient with prisoners. One lieutenant had allowed a German officer to keep a photograph of his children, just a photograph, and ended up facing a disciplinary hearing. He'd been transferred to a supply depot in Wales, his career effectively over. Another officer had looked the other way when prisoners traded cigarettes, something everyone knew happened but nobody officially acknowledged. When the Inspector General visited and found out, the officer was demoted and shipped stateside. The military didn't tolerate sentiment. Not now. Not with the war still technically ongoing. Regulations existed for reasons. Order had to be maintained. The system couldn't function if every officer started making individual exceptions based on personal feelings. But the crying continued. And Chen couldn't stop looking at that box of rings. She sent the women to their barracks, told them to get cleaned up, that they'd receive assignments later. The moment they left, Chen picked up the box and carried it to her private office. She closed the door. She sat down at her desk, and she looked at 43 gold bands, each one representing a life, a promise, a world that had been destroyed. The ring with Uigdine engraved inside. Forever yours. A band so worn it had almost no detail left, just smooth gold polished by decades of wear. Someone had worn that ring for years, maybe decades, had twisted it nervously during difficult conversations, had looked at it for reassurance during hard times. A ring with a tiny diamond chip, probably someone's life savings spent on that one small stone. Chen could imagine the young man who'd bought it, probably in some small German town before the war, before everything fell apart. Could imagine him presenting it nervously, hoping it was enough, hoping she'd say yes. A ring that was clearly too large, as if the woman wearing it had lost so much weight it no longer fit properly. Chen had seen that too often, the way war and hunger reshaped bodies, how clothing that once fit now hung loose, how rings slipped off fingers that had grown thin. A ring that looked handmade, slightly irregular, as if someone without much money or resources had fashioned it themselves. The gold wasn't entirely smooth. The band wasn't perfectly round. But someone had made it with their own hands, had poured love into every imperfection. Each one told a story. Each one represented someone who'd believed in something permanent in a world that had proved nothing was permanent at all. Chen opened her desk drawer and pulled out a file. Prisoner processing regulations. She'd read it so many times she could recite sections from memory. Section 7. Paragraph 4. All items of value, including but not limited to currency, jewelry, watches, and precious metals, must be confiscated and catalogued. Items will be returned to prisoners upon release or repatriation, unless military necessity dictates otherwise. Unless military necessity dictates otherwise. That phrase did a lot of work. It meant that anything could be kept if someone decided it served a military purpose. It meant that a wedding ring could be confiscated forever if some officer decided it might fund enemy operations or pose a security risk. It was bureaucratic language that made cruelty sound reasonable, made theft sound like policy. Chen had been raised to follow rules. Her parents had survived in America by being invisible, by never causing problems. by doing exactly what was expected. They taught her that arguing with authority was dangerous, that making waves led to consequences, that safety came from compliance. But they'd also shown her, through their actions if not their words, that rules without compassion were just organized cruelty. She'd watched her father give away food they could barely afford to spare because someone was hungrier. She'd seen her mother stay up all night mending a customer's coat without charging extra, because the woman was a widow who couldn't afford more. Small acts of kindness that broke the strict economics of survival, but affirmed something more important. Her father's words echoed in her mind. When you have power, use it to protect those who have none. Chen had power now. Not much, but some. She had the power to interpret regulations, the power to make decisions about what constituted military necessity, the power to choose between procedure and humanity. But she couldn't shake the image of that first woman twisting her ring off her finger with shaking hands. Couldn't stop hearing the sound of 43 women weeping. There was a knock at the door. Chen shoved the box of rings into her desk drawer and called, "Come in." Private Williams entered, carrying a stack of processing forms. She was 19 years old, from Iowa, fresh-faced and earnest in the way that only people who hadn't seen too much yet could be. The new transport's been logged. Lieutenant, 43 prisoners, all female, Wehrmacht auxiliary. Medical checks completed. No security concerns flagged. They're assigned to Barracks 7. Thank you, Private. Williams hesitated at the door, her hand on the knob. Lieutenant, the women are asking about their rings. When they'll get them back. Tell them they'll be returned upon repatriation. Standard. Procedure. Yes, ma'am. Williams paused again. Lieutenant, if I may. Yes, Private? One of the women. The pregnant one? She's asking if she could keep her ring. She says the baby is due soon and she wants to have it when the child is born. As a way to honor the father or something. He died at Normandy, she said. Chen felt something tighten in her chest. What's her name? Ilse Becker. She's in the medical ward under observation, but she's stable. The doctor says she should be fine if she rests. Tell her the same thing. Rings will be returned upon repatriation. Yes, ma'am. Williams left, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Chen sat alone with the drawer full of rings. Standard procedure. That phrase haunted every decision in this place. Standard procedure meant treating human beings like inventory. It meant reducing people to numbers, problems to be processed, emotions to be ignored. It meant a woman giving birth in a prison camp couldn't have her wedding ring, couldn't hold on to the last physical connection to the man who'd fathered her child. She'd accepted that logic for 18 months because she'd believed it was necessary. In war, you couldn't afford sentiment. You had to maintain order. You had to keep distance between captor and captive. Otherwise, the whole system collapsed into chaos. But right now, in this moment, Chen didn't care about the system. She cared about 43 women in Barracks 7 who'd lost their husbands, their homes, their countries, and were now losing the last physical reminder that they'd once been loved. She cared about Ilse Becker, 7 months pregnant in a prison camp medical ward, asking if she could keep a ring while she gave birth to a child whose father was already dead. That evening, Chen did something she'd never done before. She went to the women's barracks. It was against protocol. Officers didn't socialize with prisoners. Officers didn't visit barracks except for official inspections or disciplinary actions. Maintaining distance was essential to maintaining authority. But Chen needed to understand something. She needed to know if what she was feeling was sentiment, or something more important. She needed to look these women in the eyes and decide if the regulations made sense, or if they were just bureaucratic cruelty wearing the mask of order. Barracks 7 was a long converted factory floor with rows of metal cots lined up in precise military formation. 43 women occupied about half the available space. The building still smelled faintly of machine oil and fabric dye from its previous life. High windows let in the fading evening light, painting everything in shades of amber and gray. When Chen entered, every conversation stopped. The women stood at attention the way prisoners were supposed to when an officer appeared. They stood with military precision, backs straight, eyes forward, waiting. At ease, Chen said. Her German was limited to basic commands and phrases picked up over months of processing prisoners. Sit. Please. They sat slowly, uncertainly. Some perched on the edges of their cots, ready to stand again if needed. Others lowered themselves carefully, as if sitting fully might be presumptuous. Chen stood in the center of the barracks, feeling their eyes on her. She'd rehearsed what she wanted to say during the walk over, but now that she was here, the words felt inadequate. The barracks was quiet except for the distant sound of trucks moving in the compound, the murmur of voices from other buildings, the mechanical hum of camp life. 43 women watched her and waited. Your rings, Chen started, then paused. How did you explain that you needed to understand why pieces of gold mattered so much? How did you ask women who'd lost everything to explain the significance of one small thing? I need to understand. Why are they so important? For a long moment, nobody spoke. The women looked at each other, uncertain whether this was a trap, whether honesty might bring punishment. Finally, the older woman who'd sobbed during processing stood up. She was maybe 50. Chen realized now, though the war had aged her. Gray hair pulled back severely from a face that had once been beautiful and was now just tired. Deep lines around her eyes and mouth, hands that trembled slightly as she clasped them together. You are married? The woman asked in careful, heavily accented English. Chen shook her head. No. The woman nodded slowly, as if this explained something fundamental. Then is hard to understand. Wedding ring is not jewelry, is not decoration. She touched her empty ring finger unconsciously, a gesture so habitual she probably didn't realize she was doing it. Is promise. When everything else is gone, husband, home, life you knew, the ring remains. Is proof something good existed. That you were loved. That you loved someone. She sat down, and another woman stood. This was the blonde one with the cropped hair who'd been first to remove her ring during processing. Up close, Chen could see how young she actually was. Maybe 24, 25 at most. About the same age as Chen's younger sister back in San Francisco. My husband was killed in Russia. 1943, winter offensive. The woman's voice was steady, but her hands shook. We were married 6 months before he deployed. 6 months. I don't know where he's buried. I don't know if there was funeral. When the telegram came, it said only killed in action. No details. No body. No grave to visit. She paused, struggling for the English words. The ring was all I had left of him. When I wear it, I can remember what his hands looked like. I can remember how he put it on my finger in the church and promised forever. Without it, the memory fades. The details disappear. You understand? Chen did understand. These weren't valuables in any meaningful economic sense. They were anchors. They were the thing that kept these women tethered to the people they'd been before the war destroyed everything. A third woman stood, older than the blonde but younger than the first. Maybe 40. My husband is alive. I think. I hope. She spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. We were separated during the evacuation from Berlin. The city was burning. Russians were coming. Everyone was running. I got on one truck, he got on another. We were supposed to meet in Munich. That was the plan. But I don't know if he made it. If he's in prison camp somewhere. If he survived the journey. If he's looking for me. Her voice cracked. But when I look at this ring, when I looked at ring, I could believe we find each other again. That somewhere he wears his ring and thinks of me. That the promise still exists even when everything else is broken. The woman with the inscription, Uig Dine, raised her hand timidly, like a schoolchild asking permission to speak. Chen nodded to her. I am widow 3 years, the woman said quietly. My Hans died at El Alamein, North Africa, 1942. We were married 15 years when he died. 15 years. She held up her ringless hand. Every morning when I put on that ring, I said good morning to him. Every night when I took it off to sleep, I said good night. Is foolish? Yes. Talking to dead man through piece of gold? But it helped. It made the loneliness less heavy. It made me feel he was still with me somehow. One by one, other women stood and spoke. Their English varied, some fluent, some halting, some barely managing a few words, but the message was the same. The rings weren't objects. They were memories made solid. They were proof of identity when everything else had been stripped away. They were the thin thread connecting the present to a past when these women had been wives, mothers, lovers, people with names and stories and lives that mattered. A young woman, she looked about 19, spoke in German, and another woman translated. She says her ring was her grandmother's. 3 generations wore it. Her grandmother, her mother, then her when she married. Her husband is alive, a prisoner in Belgium. She says the ring is family history. Without it, she loses not just her husband, but her whole family's story. Another woman, weeping as she spoke, my ring is from my second marriage. My first husband died in car accident before the war. I never thought I would love again. Then I met Friedrich. He understood grief. We healed each other. He died at Stalingrad. The ring reminds me that even after terrible loss, love is possible. That I was brave enough to try again. Without it, I forget I am capable of hope. The stories continued, each one different, each one the same. Loss and love and memory and identity, all bound up in circles of gold. Finally, Chen held up her hand for silence. The women stopped speaking and looked at her expectantly. What if you could keep them? Chen asked quietly. The barracks went absolutely silent. The women stared at her like she'd spoken in a language they didn't understand, like the words didn't make sense even though they'd heard them clearly. The rings, Chen clarified. What if I return them? Let you keep them? Is not allowed, the older woman said carefully, suspicion and hope warring in her voice. Is against rules. Against regulations. I'm asking hypothetically. If you could keep them, would it matter? The blonde woman, Chen learned later her name was Greta, walked across the barracks until she was standing directly in front of Chen. Up close, Chen could see the exhaustion etched into her young face, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her uniform hung loose on a frame that had once carried more weight. If I could keep ring, Greta said, her voice breaking, it would mean I still exist. That I am not just prisoner, not just number, not just defeated enemy. That I am still Greta, who married Klaus in 1940, who loved and was loved. That I am still human being with past, with story, with heart that remembers. She started crying again, but this time she didn't try to hide it. You take ring. You take last piece of who I was. You understand? Is not about gold. Is not about value. Is about identity. Is about dignity. Is about being person instead of thing. She reached out, then caught herself. Remembered that touching an officer could bring punishment. Her hand dropped back to her side. You know what is hardest part of being prisoner? Is not the bad food or hard beds or locked doors. Is that everyone looks at you and sees enemy, sees German, sees uniform and nothing else. Nobody sees Greta who loved books and wanted to be teacher. Nobody sees woman who cried when her husband died, who still dreams about him, who wakes up reaching for him and finding empty space. You take ring. You take last proof that person existed. You take last piece of Greta and leave only prisoner. Chen felt something crack inside her chest. A decision crystallizing. A line being crossed. Return to your cots, Chen said. I'll be back. She left the barracks and walked directly to her office. The camp was quiet. Most personnel were at dinner in the mess hall. Guards patrolled the perimeter, but the interior pathways were empty. Chen's footsteps echoed on the concrete. She opened her office door, went straight to her desk, pulled out the box of rings. 43 gold bands. 43 stories. 43 women whose humanity had been reduced to protocol and inventory. Chen picked up the box and carried it back across the compound. When she entered Barracks 7 again, the women were sitting on their cots in tense silence. They looked up as she entered, saw the box in her hands. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Chen set the box on the nearest cot and opened it. Find your rings, she said clearly. Take them. Keep them. Wear them. Still, nobody moved. They stared at the box like it might vanish if they reached for it. Like this might be a test, a trap, something too good to be true. I'm serious, Chen said. Take your rings. They're yours. They've always been yours. The older woman stood up first. She walked to the box slowly, reverently, like someone approaching an altar. She sorted through the rings with careful hands until she found hers. She held it up to the fading light, examined it, made sure it was really hers. Then she slipped it onto her finger. Her entire face transformed. Ears seemed to fall away. She looked at her hand with the ring back in place and started crying. But this time it was different. This time it was relief. Joy mixed with grief, the complicated emotion of getting back something you'd thought lost forever. Then they all came. 43 women crowding around a cardboard box, searching through rings, finding their own, sliding them onto fingers, embracing each other. Some laughed through their tears. Some sobbed with relief. Some just stood there, staring at their hands like they'd gotten back a piece of their souls, like they'd been made whole again after being broken. Greta found her ring, the one from Klaus who died in Russia, and held it to her chest for a long moment before putting it on. Then she looked at Chen with an expression that was part gratitude, part disbelief, part something Chen couldn't quite name. Why? Greta asked. You will be in trouble for this. Big trouble. Why you risk it? Chen didn't have a good answer. Or maybe she had too many answers. Because her father had taught her that power meant responsibility to those without power. Because her mother had shown her that kindness mattered even when it cost you something. Because she'd spent 18 months watching humanity get processed out of people, and she was tired of being part of the machine. Because 43 women crying over wedding rings had broken something in her that protocol had built. Because seeing these women as people instead of prisoners meant treating them like people instead of inventory. Because you're right, Chen said finally. You're still human beings. You deserve to be treated like it. She left the barracks to the sound of women crying and laughing at the same time, to the sight of 43 hands held up to the light, examining rings, remembering promises, reclaiming identities. Chen walked back to her office in the gathering darkness. She knew what was coming. She'd violated direct orders. She'd made a unilateral decision that contradicted military policy. She'd put her judgment above command authority. When they found out, and they would find out within hours, there would be consequences. She didn't have to wait long. The next morning, Captain Bradford called Chen into his office before breakfast. He was 51 years old, a career officer who'd spent the entire war behind desks managing logistics. He believed in chain of command, proper procedure, and maintaining discipline. He did not believe in sentiment. He did not believe in exceptions. And he most certainly did not believe that individual officers had the right to override standing orders based on personal feelings. "Lieutenant Chen," he said without preamble, not inviting her to sit, "I've received a report that you returned confiscated valuables to prisoners without authorization. Is this accurate?" Chen stood at attention. "Yes, sir." "Wedding rings specifically?" "Yes, sir." Bradford leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that mixed disappointment and something else. Curiosity, maybe. Or perhaps exhaustion with the whole situation. "You understand that confiscation of valuables is not optional. It's standing policy from theater command. It's not a suggestion or a guideline. It's a direct order." "I understand, sir." "Then explain to me, and I genuinely want to understand this, why you decided that your judgment superseded military regulation. Why you thought you had the authority to unilaterally change policy." Chen had spent all night rehearsing this conversation. She'd prepared careful arguments about morale, about humanitarian considerations, about the war being essentially over, and symbolic gestures mattering for post-war reconciliation and European recovery. She'd planned to cite regulations about treatment of prisoners, to reference the Geneva Conventions, to frame her decision in military and strategic terms that Bradford might accept. But standing in his office, all those careful arguments evaporated. The truth was simpler and more damning. "Because it was cruel, sir," she said simply. "Taking their wedding rings served no military purpose. It didn't enhance security. It didn't prevent escape. It didn't gather intelligence. It was just cruelty disguised as procedure. Bureaucratic theft dressed up as policy." Bradford's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "The military doesn't require you to like the procedures, Lieutenant. It requires you to follow them. Do you understand the difference?" "Yes, sir." "I don't think you do." Bradford stood up and walked to the window overlooking the compound. Early morning light slanted across the barracks, the guard towers, the fence line. Somewhere in Barrack 7, 43 women were waking up with their wedding rings back on their fingers. "We're managing 20,000 prisoners in this sector alone, with resources meant for 10,000. Every day brings more prisoners, more complications, more demands. And we're doing this with skeleton crews because most personnel are being redeployed east or prepared for Pacific transfer." He turned back to face her. "Do you know what happens when we make exceptions? When we let individual judgment override policy? The system falls apart. If you can decide that wedding rings don't need to be confiscated, then someone else decides photographs are fine. Then someone else decides letters. Then personal diaries. Then books. Then tools. Then anything. Because every officer is making individual calls based on what they personally think is important, or cruel, or unnecessary." "Sir, with respect, I'm not finished." Bradford's voice wasn't loud, but it carried command. "You think you helped 43 women feel more human. Fine, maybe you did. But what you actually did was create an impossible precedent. Next week, we'll process another transport. 50 women, maybe 60. They'll hear about the rings. They'll expect the same treatment. When we don't give it to them, because I will not extend your personal exception to everyone, they'll feel twice as dehumanized. They'll feel like they're being treated unfairly compared to the women before them." Chen started to respond, but Bradford held up his hand. "And it gets worse. Word spreads. Other camps hear about it. Prisoners start demanding their valuables back. Guards and officers face pressure to make more exceptions. Discipline erodes. And all of this, stems from one lieutenant who decided she knew better than theater command. One person who put her feelings above the system we're all trying to maintain." He sat back down at his desk, suddenly looking very tired. "Do you see my problem, Lieutenant? Not with your intentions, I believe you meant well, but with the precedent, the chaos. The breakdown of order that follows when everyone becomes their own authority? Chen stood at attention, saying nothing. Because Bradford was right about the practical implications. She had created a precedent. She had undermined the system. And there would be consequences that rippled far beyond 43 women in Barracks 7. But she still wasn't sorry. However, Bradford continued, and Chen looked up in surprise. However, I would be lying if I said I didn't understand why you did it. I'm not blind to the human cost of what we do here. I'm not unaware that some of our procedures are... He paused, choosing his words carefully. Harsher than strictly necessary. But my job isn't to make prisoners feel better. My job is to maintain order with limited resources in an impossible situation. And your job was to help me do that. He opened a folder on his desk. I'm recommending you for reassignment. You'll be transferred to administrative duty stateside. Fort Dix, New Jersey. You'll spend the remainder of your service processing discharge paperwork. It's not a court-martial. It's not a dishonorable discharge. It's a clear message that what you did cannot be tolerated, no matter how well-intentioned. I understand, sir. Your service record will reflect exemplary performance, except for this incident. You'll be eligible for